studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
We begin this evening with dramatic news from Libya. Muammar Gaddafi, the former Libyan leader, was killed today in his hometown of Sirte. There are also reports that Gaddafi's son, Mu'tasim, was also killed. Gaddafi fled into hiding 2 months ago after his regime was toppled. His death ends an 8-month-long war waged by rebel forces and supported by NATO. Gaddafi ruled Libya for more than 4 decades. Prime Minister Mahmoud Jibril said today, "We've been waiting for this moment for a long time." President Obama spoke about this today from the White House.
Today, the government of Libya announced the death of Muammar Gaddafi. This marks the end of a long and painful chapter for the people of Libya, who now have the opportunity to determine their own destiny in a new and democratic Libya. For 4 decades, the Gaddafi regime ruled the Libyan people with an iron fist. Basic human rights were denied, innocent civilians were detained, beaten, and killed, and Libya's wealth was squandered. The enormous potential of the Libyan people was held back, and terror was used as a political weapon. Today, we can definitively say that the Gaddafi regime has come to an end. The dark shadow of tyranny has been lifted, and with this enormous promise, the Libyan people now have a great responsibility to build an inclusive and tolerant and democratic Libya that stands as the ultimate rebuke to Gaddafi's dictatorship. We look forward to the announcement of the country's liberation, the quick formation of an interim government, and a stable transition to Libya's first free and fair elections.
Despite this symbolic and significant moment, there are many questions that remain about the future of Libya. Here to talk about that, from Washington, David Ignatius of the Washington Post. In New York, Lisa Anderson, president of the American University in Cairo, and Hisham Matar, Libyan writer and author of Anatomy of a Disappearance. I am pleased to have them here on this program. I begin with you, David. When we first heard about this, I said, you know, this is a fascinating story for all kinds of reasons. But first, I'd like to know what happened. We've had a few hours since this story first broke. Can you tell me what you have learned about how this came down?
Gaddafi was discovered hiding in a sewage culvert about 3 kilometers from Sirte, which is his hometown where he'd been thought to be hiding out. He was apprehended there. Precisely how that happened isn't clear. And then the details of how he came to be shot and the nature of the wounds are very unclear.
So what do we make of this in terms of what the implications are for a new government coming together in Libya?
Well, this is it's a very significant national moment for Libya. It's largely symbolic because things have been changed already on the ground before. But I think we mustn't miss its symbolism because, like most of these incredibly fundamental national moments, it has in it all sorts of momentum and all sorts of possibility and invitations for what happens next. And I think these possibilities and these invitations aren't just for Libya, but also for other countries such as the United States. In the sense that I think the conversation has been, what has been missing from the conversation is how has American complicity made this revolution more difficult for the Libyans. In the sense that today, following the news and listening to various American commentators, it's been very bizarre for me listening to it, to hear this kind of tune that, oh, well, he was this idiosyncratic leader who was a bit of a troublemaker and he was really a nuisance in the world, but then we really tried to welcome him back into the fold. And then, but once the Arab Spring started, it was no longer, possible to support him, which isn't exactly what has happened. What has happened is that the American foreign policy has propped up Gaddafi, has made the revolution more difficult for Libyans in many, many ways, tangible ways, and has arguably extended the lifespan of this arcane, aggressive, violent regime. And the moment that that narrative changed was when the facts on the ground changed and wasn't led by, international diplomacy. It was led by the rebels on the ground. And so I think we need to take a pause here and reconsider this narrative that sells the story as a kind of success of American foreign policy at this moment, and really see it as an invitation to start to deal with Libya in a different way, to end this old parasitic relationship that America has had with Libya, and to start to really, reconsider the narrative from the point of view of a sense of solidarity between the American people and the Libyan people. That the understanding that the engagement, by and large, of America with Libya has made life for Libyans on the ground very difficult. So I see this as an incredibly significant moment and a wonderful invitation for men and women of culture, men and women of justice, and people who believe in the institutions of the law, to start on both sides, in Libya and in America, to start to be vigilant with our governments and to start to dictate to them, or try to dictate to them at least, the sort of future that we want.
Do you hold your criticism and indictment only for the United States or other Western countries that dealt with Gaddafi?
Everybody that dealt with Gaddafi, everybody that has put their interests of corporations and so-called national security in front of the interests of everyday people in Libya.
And would this have happened as soon as it did without the French and the United States and NATO coming to the moment in which they were about to come to Benghazi with a threatened massacre that might have done great damage to the rebels?
Absolutely not. It wouldn't have. I believe that the international intervention was absolutely necessary, and it really made this possible.
How do you see this moment, in terms of Arab history, in terms of the Arab Spring, in terms of the future of Libya, and in terms of the role of the West in the Arab world?
I agree with Hisham. This is a hugely important historical moment, mostly for Libya, but not only for Libya. This is the end of, one hopes, the end of a century of rapacious government in Libya, starting with the Italian invasion in September 1911. A terrible, terrible episode, which not enough people know about. And in some respects, Gaddafi could build on that history to extend this sort of rapacious approach to his own people. I also agree with Hisham that the Americans particularly, I think in general the international community, but the Americans particularly were deeply, deeply cynical in their resumption of relations with Libya because of the Libyan willingness to cooperate on the war on terror.
Now, with this symbolic moment, we can also focus on what the future of Libya is and who might emerge and what kind of government and what kind of foreign policy that government might have.
The first task for this government, and I think an important test of whether it really can govern Libya, will be to take the somewhat disparate collection of militias, many of them have tribal roots that have been part of the revolution, and try to build them into a single national army, a reliable army that can defend the country. Is important everywhere in the world. That'll be job one. The United Nations is going to take responsibility for what we call nation building, working with the Libyan transitional government on governance structures, on rebuilding infrastructure. There'll be several hundred people working for a UN special representative. In all of these ways, what's interesting to me, Charlie, about Libya is that this really is an illustration of a different kind of foreign policy venture in which the United States plays an important role, but is part of an international coalition, is part of a NATO force. Indeed, after the first week, takes a back seat in that NATO force, is part of a UN mission to help rebuild Libya and assist with governance, but is not the dominant nation builder.
Does this have any ramifications for Bashar Assad in Syria?
Absolutely. I think it affects the whole region, and also this idea of, what I think is absolutely significant about the Arab Spring is not just the facts of, getting rid of dictators, but it's that the entire landscape of the human imagination, of the political imagination, has shifted. But my sense is that the fundamental underpinning of how America sees a country like Libya hasn't necessarily changed or been challenged. And this is, as an American and a Libyan, and somebody who's, for most of my life I have been subjected to watching my two countries dealing with each other based on the principles of blood and money. I am very jealous about protecting this moment and saying that, again, this is a moment where we can question the fundamental underpinning of this relationship.
David, I'd let you respond on your own.
People do remember what happened in Baghdad in 2003 after the American invasion, the looting and lawlessness, the inability of the U.S. to deal with it, the way in which order and trust in people amongst themselves began to disappear. So people have been worrying about all these questions, and what pleases them as they look at this is that the Libyan people themselves, through this revolution, have addressed the issues so that all the contingency planning that was going on behind the scenes for worst cases, so you'd be ready for them, in the end wasn't necessary. And I think that's testimony to the deep roots of the revolution, and also of the ability of Libyans on the ground to maintain order and keep things together. Revolutions are crazy periods. So again, I don't know if that speaks to your concern, but I wanted to mention it.
Why didn't he leave, Gaddafi?
Why didn't he leave?
Yeah.
He was going to die a martyr to his
He
revolution.
always understood that. Libya was certainly different from Egypt, specifically where you are.
Indeed.
Less of a nation than a collection of tribes and people, and less civil institutions than in other societies. Does that make it enormously more difficult in terms of creating a new central force?
Absolutely. I mean, the challenges that Libya confronts are, I think, almost unique in the world, in the sense that the Gaddafi regime systematically, deliberately, for 4 decades ensured that there was not a single military establishment, there was not a central bureaucratic public administration. All of those kinds of things were, whenever you saw anything like that appear, they were destroyed. And so you now have a country that's really sort of shards on the ground. I think the thing that I find most heartening about this, apart from the fact that there's now an opportunity to build something new, is something that is common in the Arab Spring, which is we tend to think of these revolutions as demand for rights against authoritarian regimes, which clearly they are. But they're also demands for responsibilities, that these are regimes that never permitted the ordinary person to have responsibility for his community, his society, or his country. And that's why you see people being able to pick up the pieces, almost literally, in a place like Libya and say, yes, we can run Benghazi, yes, we can run hospitals, we can do this. So in that sense, I think this is a historical moment in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia where you see very different problems, but the impulse to solve them, to say, yes, as a citizen, I am going to participate in the solution, is common. And it's hard not to be optimistic in those circumstances.
I want to close on this with your father's story, because clearly there are 1,000 stories like this, and part of the reason that people were prepared to die to see this regime overthrown was because of what the experiences of people like your father.
Yes, in the sense that this revolution has been a long time coming.
Right.
It's not just the people who bravely fought and died in this time, but there have been people who have been fighting for a long time.
And killed.
And killed and disappeared, and that connection was actually made by the demonstrations, the early demonstrations. That they were carrying photographs of people like my father who had disappeared or been killed, or 21 years ago. And so, in the sense, what is fantastic about this moment is this return to sanity, in the sense that one of the most, difficult things about living under Gaddafi, I would argue, wasn't just, the visible signs of oppression, the killing and so on, but also this reality where nothing really quite made sense, where huge actions were done and the consequences were somehow forgotten or swept under the carpet. And the Libyan revolution somehow made sense of our history and returned us to sanity, but also returned us to a place of confidence. Because this, the sense of deep shame, that Libyans have felt for a long time, was very isolating.
In a sense, the shame of feeling like that they could not overthrow the chains that Gaddafi had wrapped around them?
Shame because we were represented by arguably one of the most absurd and one of the most cruel dictatorships in modern history. Shame because the Libyan dictatorship's method of oppression involved very heavily humiliation. So it wasn't only content with silencing you, but humiliating you on a daily basis.
Thank you. It's good to see you on the stage. Ray Dalio is here. He is the founder of Bridgewater Associates. He created the investment firm in 1975 out of a two-bedroom apartment in New York City. Today, the company manages roughly $125 billion in global investments. Its clients include foreign governments, sovereign banks, central banks, and institutional pension funds. Over the last 2 years, Bridgewater ranked as the largest and best-performing hedge fund in the world. In 2010, its returns were greater than the profits of Google, Amazon, and eBay combined. I'm very pleased to have Ray Dalio at this table for the first time to talk about a perspective on the global economic scene and a whole range of issues having to do with where we see ourselves, and also a look at his own philosophy and what has informed his own opinions and the way he looks at the world. Having said that, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
What is Bridgewater Associates?
It's a global macro firm. We assess what the world economy is like and how asset classes will change, and we are managing money for pension funds and endowments, like you described, the Pennsylvania teachers, those types of pension funds, for trying to keep them safe.
When you look at the world today, the global economic picture, I read today Goldman Sachs had a disappointing performance. J.P. Morgan did not do as well as some had hoped it might be. What's happening with financial firms?
I think it's important to understand that we're going through a deleveraging. Okay, so we have to understand the big picture is there's a deleveraging. The three big themes. First, there's a deleveraging. Secondly, we have a problem with monetary and fiscal policy, so we're out of ammunition. And thirdly, we have an issue in terms of people, most importantly, who are at each other's throats politically and globally in terms of having a problem resolving those. Imagine you earned $100,000 a year and you didn't have any debt. You can go to a bank and you can borrow $10,000 a year. You could spend, therefore, $110,000 a year. And when you spend $110,000 a year, somebody else earns $110,000. And they can go to a bank, and there's a self-reinforcing process in which your debt rises in relationship to your income. And that goes on for a long time, and that goes on for 50 or 75 years. Through history, we've had these 50, 75-year cycles. And then you reach a point where you can't anymore get more debt, and the process starts to change, and you can't leverage up. Traditionally, the private sector leverages up. We leveraged up, and we got to a point in 2007 where we had a bubble. And that same sort of bubble that happened in Japan, same sort of bubble that happened in the Great Depression, meaning we reached our debt limits. Europe's reached its debt limits. So then we begin the process in reverse. As you can't spend as much, somebody else's income falls. And that process works in reverse. So we're in a deleveraging. So I think that this is important globally. That's what Europe's in. So when we deal with Goldman Sachs, or when we deal with banks, or when we deal with Europe, I think you could break the world into two parts. There's the debtor developed world, which has reached its debt limits and is going through a deleveraging. And then there's the creditor emerging world, the countries like China, which are competitive and are beginning to have those big surpluses, and they're lending us money. And so we have this big imbalance in the world. You can break the world into two parts: debtor developed countries and emerging creditor countries, and they have a big imbalance, which is a debt problem. That's the nature of the beast of what's going on.
And how long will the deleveraging take place? 10 years?
These take place over 10 years. The key is to spread it out as much as you can to make sure that it's not disorderly.
Let me talk about the dysfunction issue. We can't solve our problems domestically in the United States, our economic problems, unless there is some sense of respect for other people's views and some sense of being able to come together and find solutions that are in the interest of the country, not necessarily always in the interest of the ideology or the party.
Yes, and I think that's the problem so pervasively. We were talking about culture. It is when people disagree, and you can take thoughtful people disagree, you have then the potential of learning a lot. If people who are disagreeing can say, why do we disagree, and work through that conversation in an intelligent way to try to find out what's true, you can learn, you can make progress. It can be a fabulous thing. When you instead have people who are talking behind each other's backs and all criticizing and all looking for blame, this is a problem. I think the real question is how we approach those. Can we approach that in a thoughtful way in which we work that through? Let's say, for example, the government budget balance.
Right.
The government budget balance, if you raised taxes, if everybody just sucked it in a little bit, you raise taxes by 3%. You cut spending by 3%. I'm using 3% as an example to say not much. Everybody should be able to pay 3% more, or you should be able to cut your expenditures by 3%.
If the government did that?
If the government did that, they would eliminate half the budget deficit. It's estimated about $8.5 trillion over the next 10 years is what we're going to have as a deficit. They would eliminate half of that. Now, can't we...
Over how long a period?
Next 10 years.
Next 10 years, all right.
Now, I'm asking you, can we, if we could have every American pay, can everybody pay 3% more? Can everybody just spend 3% less? You can make a heck of a contribution to that. Instead, we have a division that's going on in which we, the basic division is Republicans will say that we shouldn't raise taxes.
Or even reduce deductions. Or even reduce deductions.
In that way of raising taxes. So we can't pay more. And Democrats say that we must raise taxes because we can't cut the spending. Right. Okay? So the delineation that as we came into that was the debt limit issue. That remains the debt limit issue. And there's vested interests involved. 70% of the taxes are paid by the top 10% of income earners, income taxes. So what we have is a division here in which there's not a coming together, I believe, and that means that in a deleveraging, at a difficult time, we're not dealing with it in the best possible way, but it's human nature.
We are doing, as they say, kicking the can down the road, and not dealing with it. Suppose the super committee does not reach an agreement in terms of its requirement, and therefore the mechanism, the trigger mechanism, kicks in. What does your team think about that, and what the impact will that be?
Charlie, I'm meant to be a realistic person. And sometimes when there's concerns, it's difficult to talk about difficult situations. So I want to try to answer your question as honestly as I possibly can. But I want to say that I'm very concerned not just of that fuss. I do not believe that we will find a political solution. I think that would not be. I'm pessimistic about that.
So you have the same opinion that Standard & Poor's had when they reduced America's credit rating. Right.
Essentially. So I think, and by the way, I think it's very important to understand that the government debt is the terrible, challenging issue that we should talk about, maybe. But also, more important, is the private sector debt. So that resolving the public sector debt does not resolve the problem. That individuals face the same problem, meaning that they're overly indebted. And because they're overly indebted and spent a lot of their consumption was through borrowing, and they had it was like if you borrow, you have a party and everything's good and you have a prosperity and you have your party, you hire the caterers, they're employed and everybody's happy. So that there's a private sector debt issue at the same time as a public sector debt. They're both. So if you resolve the budget deficit, you do not resolve the private sector debt issue. Both of those things mean we're both overly indebted. We cannot, the amount that we owe and have promised in its various forms can't be paid. Now, we can accept, is that right or wrong? But I think we need to talk about forthrightly whether that's right or wrong. And if it's right, and I believe it's right, then we have to talk calmly and logically about how we can approach that and deal with it in the best possible way without having this battle of one side or another. Like the issue of, is it better to have austerity or stimulus? The basic problem there is that there's not a quality conversation on the subject. So if people who disagree could sit down and work, and on a television show or something, work through how does the machine work, how does the economic machine work, what does it mean to each of those, how has it worked in the past, so that they can understand what exists, get past the ideology part of it, and get on with trying to say we have this very difficult situation, and how do we deal with it in our best possible way together. We can't solve the problem easily because we still have too much debt. But we can move forward in being able to make the best of it. We can spread it out. We can keep orderly. We have a situation now in which we have a very severe situation, not only because we have a deleveraging going on, but we have a situation in which monetary policy cannot work the way it worked in the past, that fiscal policy will not be stimulative. So neither the private sector nor the public sector. And
to interrupt for a moment, some people say that they describe that as there are no more tools in the toolkit.
There are no more tools in the toolkit.
In terms of fiscal and monetary policy.
Yes. So number one is we have a deleveraging. Now that deleveraging means we're going to have more debt problems. You're going to see no matter what is solved in Europe, you will have a deleveraging. Banks will lend less. And lending less will mean a contraction. That is what I believe is the case. We should talk about whether or not that is the case. Thoughtful people should discuss that. If it is the case, we should then approach how do we deal with that. Now, so I'm saying I believe there's a deleveraging going on. There are no tools in the toolkit, and everybody's at each other's throats. So that there's not a quality conversation of what is true, how do we best handle it.
We have had that debate about, the need for growth, which would be a stimulative impact on the economy, and at the same time, a need to reduce spending because of the debt and the deficit as well as the long-term debt. You need also to make investments for the future in terms of science and research and a whole range of issues so that this country can be competitive around the world. Make sure it trains scientists and doctors and people, who make a positive long-term contribution to the economy. What is your own analysis as to how we find the right balance between austerity and growth, or austerity and stimulus?
I think it just comes back to the fundamentals, the same for us individually. The economics for a government work the same as the economics pretty much for the individual. That whatever we expend money on, we have to make sure, there are certain things that are critical. First, you have to make sure that it produces an income to pay it back. Mm-hmm. Investment. In other words, in some fashion or another, what we have to do is make sure that when we put that money out and let's say we build infrastructure. I believe that you can build infrastructure. I believe that you can hire people unproductive people now who are idle. I think the worst thing now is not only the economics of it, but I think the social impact of individuals who are not working, are living beneath their potential. Is a dangerous thing. It's a social tragedy. It's not good for them. It's not good for the society. It's a cancer that exists. They have to be made productive, but you can't waste money doing it. So those jobs, whatever they may end up being, or those investments, have got to have a payback. And then,
did the stimulus program that was enacted by the Congress after this president assumed office, did it make a contribution to growth at all, as far as you're concerned?
It certainly made a big contribution.
It did create jobs, because some people would like to believe that stimulus program didn't create jobs, and you're here to say, with your own analysis, it did create some jobs.
Oh, a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, but we, at the same time, and it created growth and it created some jobs. At the same time, we have this overriding factor that is depressing jobs. So it created jobs in an environment, and so let's turn to what is depressing jobs.
Right.
Okay.
What is?
What's depressing jobs is that the world supply and demand for labor has changed. In other words, there's a lot more people working as China came on and India came on, and they are competitive. The world supply of labor has increased, and technology has had an effect. So we're in an interesting era, because I think almost if you think of a person as in a machine, an economic machine, as being a tool, a part of that economic machine, the demand for labor has changed in a very profound way. It's an interesting question. We might enter into a period in which we don't need people as tools. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean?
The two reasons that people are enormously curious about you. Number one is simply the objective success of what Bridgewater has done and become. And secondly, there are interesting questions as to how you think about the world and how you think about investments. You have mentioned a couple of times the economic machine. Give us a sense of what that means to you, because my understanding is that's central to a philosophy you have about the way the economy works.
Reality works in a certain way. You have to understand how reality works. If interest rates go to zero and you can't ease monetary policy, how does the economic machine work? Okay, a central bank can make a purchase and get money in the hands of somebody else, or blah, 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 blah. There is a certain machine. It is operated this. You can raise your debt relative to your income to so far, but you can't raise it more than that. And then when you reach that, that changes. So the private sector cannot, there are such laws of economics, such realities of if, let's say Europe, I'll give you another one. We have a debt problem in Europe. You can either transfer the money from one rich country to a poor country.
Right. Germany to Greece.
You can print the money.
Can't do it.
Or the ECB can say, I'll find a way to do it, whatever.
Right.
Or you can write them down. Those are the choices.
So-called haircut.
Haircut.
A machine for you is a theory of the way things work.
So, yeah, that's right. It's a description of reality. If I ski and I'm putting my weight on my downhill ski, I will make a better turn than if I don't.
And you always make a point that you know what you don't know, and that's equally valuable.
More valuable. I want to say that, so this is the whole philosophy.
Right.
I so know that I can be wrong. Look, we all should recognize that we can be wrong. And if we recognize that we're wrong and we worry about being wrong, then what we should do is have a thoughtful dialogue.
Okay, but
so the way I get to success, it's not what I know. Okay, I mean, I've acquired some things that I know along the way, and they're helpful.
It is.
But
it is. It's not what you know, but it is.
It's knowing what I don't know, or worrying that I'll be wrong, that makes me find. Well, I want people to criticize my point of view. I want to hold out, say I think this, but I may be wrong. And if you can attack what I'm saying, in other words, stress test what I'm saying, I'll learn.
So that everybody knows. So therefore, people will be free to tell you what they think.
Of course.
Because you know that it will not be held against you, and you can benefit from it.
That's right. Right?
So anybody in a meeting at your company can stand up and say, Ray,
absolutely,
you're absolutely wrong.
Of course.
And you have not been precise, and your assumptions are flawed.
Oh, it's so essential, right? There's the number one principle at our place is that if something doesn't make sense to you, you have the right to explore it, to see if it makes sense. I don't want people around who do things that they don't think make sense, because I'm going to have not thinking people.
Right.
So that they have not only the right, they have the obligation. Don't walk away thinking something's wrong.
Failure teaches you more than success?
Of course. One of my favorite books is Einstein's Mistakes.
Right. And because it showed you that even Einstein, the most brilliant person of the century in common judgment, made mistakes.
The great fallacy all, I think, of all of mankind practically. I mean, it's a big statement. But the great fallacy is that people know more than what they do, and there's a discovery process. And so when you look at, that's the process for learning. The process for learning is to say, I don't know. Like, I'm totally comfortable being incompetent. I like being incompetent. I don't mind being incompetent. If I don't, how much can you be competent about? And so that whole notion of, do you like learning? Do you like finding out what's true and building on it without an ego? And that becomes the problem. How many statements do you listen to people that begin, I think this, I think that, where they should be asking, I wonder.
What's in here? And why did you write it? Because you wanted people who come to work with you to understand what your own philosophy was about openness, about management, about dialogue, about the machine.
Yes.
Some of that.
So what I think every place has to have a culture.
Right.
And culture is the values, what values are living out. And so, for example, the number one value is it has to make sense to you. We have to talk about it. We have to work it through in a non-egotistical kind of way. And so it's an unusual place and it's an unusual culture.
Are you offended when people sometimes label it a cult?
I think a cult, when I think of a cult, it means believe this. And it's the opposite.
Yeah. You take it from on high.
In other words, a cult means, somebody's telling you believe this.
Because I said so.
And follow it.
Because I have a superior wisdom.
Okay. It's exactly the opposite of that, right? The number one principle is don't believe anything, think for yourself. And now let's go through a process of what is true together. But we can't stop that with ego. We can't let that barrier stand in our way. So we're going to live in a culture in which we can do that, okay? Now, that's the opposite of, it's a belief system. In other words, I'll ask you, do you believe that we should operate this way with each other? Okay? If you want to call that a cult, I think it's the opposite of a cult. It means think, right? Speak up. Don't hide it. Don't talk behind people's backs. It's talking behind people's...
Okay. Did you have these ideas for a long time, or these ideas that you came to through your own experience and your own living and your own sense of what you read and what you questioned, and you came to this?
Of course, through my whole life. Now, as I say, when I started at the markets, the knowing I don't know and the liking to have people challenge me. So when I was young, I did like that, to know. I did know that I'm an independent thinker. And I know that for an independent thinker, and I like to innovate. We like to innovate. And if you're going to have an innovative thinker, there's a high chance they'll be wrong. And if you have to have an independent thinker, they're going to have a different point of view than the next person. So if you're going to have innovation and independent thinking, you're going to have the ability to disagree, to find out what's wrong. And I learned through my whole experience, day after day, that the cost of being wrong is a terrible thing. So I worry about being wrong. And because I worry about being wrong, I want to know what's true. Yeah. And we have a community here. I want to know what's true, including my strengths and weaknesses, so that I know how to deal with them. And I want to be in a community of other people who want to do that.
Do you believe as...
And by the way, that's connected to our performance.
You're having this dialogue with members of the Tea Party on the Republican side and members of the President's administration on the other side. What would you tell them about the necessity for revenue in the next 10 years?
Well, here's what I would be telling them.
You got to tell them more than just talk.
Okay, no, but here's what I would say. Can I, Mr. President, Mr. Alternative Republican...
Mr. Cantor, let's say.
Okay, can we first, just together, sit down in a room, together with whoever you want to bring in, and go through an exercise of finding out, forget what we should do at the moment, just find out a discussion of how does the economic machine work? How does the machine work? Let's not get to what we're doing at the moment. And can we agree on how the machine works?
Do you think they've done that or not?
They don't do that. They don't. This is the big thing. Everybody's looking at what to do, and there's a debate.
Well, but no, this was about can they do what I said. Do you think they have done that or not? Meaning, have they sat down and said, let's just test all of our assumptions about what's necessary and the way the system works, the way the machine works?
No. So that's the interesting thing. Everybody's looking about what to do, and then each approaches it with a bias, and we're not in a conversation that's a quality conversation of how the machine works.
And part of the argument has to do with how you read history, too. Those people who
we can do it together.
Right.
Okay, we
read
can
history together. All right.
Not only, and you can, at a very nuts and bolts level, I could take any period of history and put it through my template. There's a template I wrote that describes how I think the machine works.
Right. Well, you have signed the Giving Pledge of Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, have you not?
Yeah.
When you look at the Buffett rule about, as a man who has a huge income, how do you feel about the Buffett rule vis-a-vis the way you look at it in terms of whether there needs to be more sacrifice on the part of people who are at the highest level of the economic?
So I think the answer to that is probably true. Okay,
Yeah.
I think that, but I want to be clear. I want to say more than this on the subject. I think that there's not enough discussion on people being. How do we get people to be self-sustaining? So the number one thing I want for my kids, the number one gift I can give my kids, or the number one gift that I can give anybody, is that you're self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. It's not a matter of even living standards. It's the notion of if you're self-sufficient, you have the freedom to make your own choices.
It's a bit like the biblical parable, isn't it, about giving them fish or teaching them how to fish?
Yeah, and you can make whatever choices in life you want to make, but you're self-sufficient. And on an ethical standard, it means that what I'm giving is equivalent to what I'm taking. Self-sufficiency, right? Mm-hmm. So what I want to do, what I think that we need to do, is say this large percentage of the population, how do we make them useful? How do we make them self-sufficient? Let's all agree on a goal of how to achieve that. So like my kids, I don't want to just give money. Let me give you. I'm going to give away a lot more than half of my money.
Right.
I'd be happy to give that to the government. If the government put together programs that were like I'm giving away to charity, to certain programs, in which I believe the money is efficiently used to help people. Let's say, for example, if the government created a series of programs that said there's this education, Teach for America, KIPP, I can read these things off, okay, of these types of things that
all those you support.
Yeah, or it doesn't have to be those.
Yeah.
It just has to be good.
Right.
Okay? If the
results
government
have to be
yes. So, for example, Arne Duncan,
Secretary of Education.
Secretary of Education, is a fantastic person for dealing with improving the quality of education in the United States, and he raced for the top and such.
So you'd say, I'd be happy for my taxes to be raised if I knew that the money would go to be administered by someone like Arne Duncan?
Oh, man. Or even create a series of quality. I will fund that opportunity. Don't waste it. Don't waste it. Put it to good use for education, for opportunity. So I think that what the country's most important thing to give anybody is opportunity.
Let me take this downtown to where there's an economic protest at Wall Street. Give me your sense. You clearly have read about that and look at it. What do you think's at stake there, and what do you think they're saying to us?
I think the number one problem is that we're not having a quality dialogue. So I wish that I could sit down.
So somebody should be listening and...
No, we get together. Sit here in a room like you with those thoughts and understand how what's going on and what's true. So, for example, on that particular case, I don't know that I adequately know the various points of views that are behind it.
Right.
I certainly understand the frustration. I understand the dilemma. I understand that there's discontent.
Discontent about somehow feeling that.
So it seems to me
some people did better because of the way the rules were, or some people did better because they had power to influence Washington and they didn't. And
so I think we need to work ourselves through that. Sorry.
No. Go ahead. Finish.
Okay. So I think that not only do we have to work ourselves through that, I would say like the question really is also a question that should be designated for our legislators, our government, because if the government makes the rules, people will either did they break laws or did they not break laws? This is a question of how should behavior be managed. Like I think I did everything right. I did well for my customers. My customers are pension funds, teachers, and data. I did well when others didn't. And I'm going to say that they are very grateful. We have a wonderful relationship, 15-year wonderful relationship. What happens is I happen to earn 1/5 of the profits.
Right.
So then,
being 20%.
Okay, I earn 20% of the profits.
And you take a 2% fee for doing it.
Yes, what covers my overhead and a bit more.
Right.
But anyway, I earn this money as a result. Very similar to, I would say, any of those companies you mentioned, eBay and so on and so forth. I pay about 1/3 in taxes. I give away about 1/3, and that's what I do, and I follow the law. And if I'm doing something that is incorrect, that they think is incorrect, I'd like to know that, and I would also like to say, should those laws, is that right or wrong?
You want the people who work for you to tell you exactly what they believe and to be able to document the fact that it's not just what they believe, but it's what they have discovered. And you want to test those ideas in the marketplace of your own firm before you go off and act on those assumptions, correct?
Yes.
So what is it telling you now if Greece defaults, and whether that has a contagion ability to leap across the Atlantic and have some influence on the U.S. economy? What is it telling you, about whether China, for example, can maintain the level of economic growth it's had and avoid the kind of social conflicts that might exist in that society? What does it tell you, about emerging nations and what it is that, what impact they will have on commodity prices? And what does it tell you about, the future of the dollar as a currency? All those kinds of issues.
You got a bunch of questions.
I know I do.
Also, I'll do the best.
Right.
I'll do the best I can
in my remaining minutes.
Okay. I would want to say that there are two worlds. There is a debtor developed countries, and there's emerging creditor countries. Classically, the United States and China.
Right.
One is a creditor, one is a debtor. We're still borrowing, we're still in debt, they're still earning. Then those two worlds can be broken into two, those that can print money and those that can't print money. So now when I'm giving you the total answer in my remaining minutes, Europe a lot of it can't print money. Therefore, it will have to deal with whether there's a transfer of wealth. There's a limit to that transfer of wealth. And so we are going to deal with the question of whether they will print money or get the haircuts. I think they'll do both.
Right.
When looking at China, because they can't raise interest rates because of their existing monetary policy, is that they can't control credit growth in the normal ways that we control credit growth. So there's a credit bubble emerging there. Mm-hmm. And in other words, there's the quality of lending, and it's bypassing the credit system. And that's something that the Chinese will need to get a control of because it's a dangerous thing. And so that creates their risk. If I take then the United States, we're in a position in which there is this deleveraging. Deleveraging is risky. So, for example, banks are leveraged about 12 to 15, 17 times.
Right.
15 times is a round number, depends on the bank. They're leveraged 15 to 1. And if they go down by 1/15, we have a capital problem, and we're in a deleveraging. Those problems, bank crises that have existed every 10 years normally, we can have a problem. We don't have the ability to have the same effect of monetary policy as we did before, because a central bank, when it's monetary, it can buy a bond.
Right.
It can therefore buy the bond. It gives it that money to somebody who sold the bond, right, and they were going to buy something like a bond. Getting it in the hands of somebody who spends it on cars and houses, who really is probably too much in debt, is not an easy thing to do for monetary policy. So monetary policy is not as effective. And then we have this social tension. So we should be able to, there's this downward pressure of the deleveraging. We should be able to grow at a rate that's comparable to our income growth if we keep orderly and we work this through and everything is orderly. That means something between like 1.5% or 2%. We should be growing at maybe at about the 2% vicinity. The problem with the 2% vicinity is that the unemployment rate remains the same or can trend higher. That produces social pressures. That produces tension, which itself means that you can have a situation analogous to that which is existing in Greece. And the more social pressure you create, the more tension that is existing and emerging in various ways, not just the Wall Street piece, but is existing in Spain. So if we can keep orderly and not argue with each other and not do disruptive things, and we don't go down, okay, and grow at that 2%, maybe then it'll be okay. If we have disruption, and we are not able to have a monetary policy, and we can't have fiscal stimulation, and you have a problem of what do, you can't recapitalize the banks. I mean, if you should happen to need to recapitalize the banks, you can't have a TARP program again.
Politically not feasible.
Politically not feasible. So you have to have a plan. You need to be thoughtful, I think. How do you create that plan? And not only, it's a theoretical thing when I say how do you create a plan, because you have to be able to have agreement to implement the plan. You can't have people at odds. As I say sometimes to policymakers, my job is much easier than their job. My job is that I just have to pretty much anticipate what's going to happen and be one step ahead. Now, it's not an easy job, but it's an easier job than policymakers who have to do that. They have to then find a solution for the bad stuff not happening. That's not easy to find solutions. And then even if they had solutions, they have to get that solution through the political system, in which there's this everybody saying that you can't do that, whatever that is, and everybody blaming each other.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I suppose if I was fit, I'm concerned. I think it's a test of us. It's a test of us and our society. It's a test of us.
On that note, thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.